Hey students, this is Professor Gore. This lecture is going to be kind of covering the era of good feelings, which is basically right after the War of 1812 into James Monroe's presidency, just because as the Federalist Party dies out, there's only kind of one party rule, and some a journalist at that time called it the era of good feelings because it's supposed to be a time of not much bad things going on. Of course, there are some things that are going to be of conflict, but that was just kind of the term that was used at the time, and so it's often used in history textbooks and so forth. So we ended the previous lecture talking about the War of 1812 and its legacy, and so I want to kind of recap that before we move on. So big impacts of the War of 1812, even though we technically lost militarily, the British burning our capital and so forth, and our biggest victory coming 2 weeks after the war ended at the Battle of New Orleans that kind of propelled Andrew Jackson to kind of a legendary status, and it also propelled William Henry Harrison to war hero status as well. And both of those men are going to become presidents. But the big thing is it really increases American nationalism. It unfortunately moves Native Americans west. As they get pushed more and more off land, we're going to see into the Democratic Revolution lecture where the Indian Removal Act is going to remove Indians in the American Southeast and the Midwest to Oklahoma and Kansas. But it also leads to the growth of American literature, truly uniquely American literature, also uniquely American art style called the Hudson River School. So, but those are things that we'll be talking about, as well as Supreme Court cases in this lecture, and the rise of John Quincy Adams, and then the feud between that emerges between him and Andrew Jackson. So this is kind of an interesting quote I love sharing with students, just because I think it makes you proud to be an American. But this is from a lieutenant in the British Navy who wrote about the Americans. Says, "I don't like Americans. I never did. I never shall like them. I have no wish to eat with them, drink with them, deal with them, or consort with them in any way. But let me tell you the whole truth, nor fight with them. Were it not for the laurels to be acquired by overcoming an enemy so brave, determined, and alert, and every way so worthy of one's steel as they have always proved." So basically, don't jack with the United States. He thinks they're obnoxious, but he respects them. So now this is example of Hudson River School painting, uniquely American art style. And what it was is it painted the beauty of American landscapes. Now, the United States has got some incredibly beautiful landscapes, without question. I've seen some in national parks, hope to see more throughout my lifetime. But you can look at these paintings; they're a little bit exaggerated and so forth, but it's to show the point of the beauty of American landscapes. So let's talk about James Monroe. I actually have a biography on him called "The Last Founding Father," because he was the last of the Revolutionary War generation to serve as President of the United States. He was from Virginia, like Washington and Madison and Jefferson. So he's the fourth president from Virginia. The last president to kind of dress in the colonial era style. He kind of dressed that style longer than what everybody else did. So it's kind of a fashion faux pas at the time. But anyway, he's kind of a lesser known president, and one that kind of gets overlooked, but actually quietly does a good job throughout his presidency. So he gets inaugurated in March of 1817, leaves office in March of 1825. So he does get elected to 2 terms. He would have been elected unanimously for one of his terms, but one person abstained from voting, just so that George Washington would be the only one electoral college that would have that accomplishment. So he did attend the College of William Mary, famous kind of like Ivy League type school in Virginia. He did fight with the Continental Army, so he is a veteran of the American Revolution. Was a lawyer, like many of the founding fathers. Was a United States senator, and helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. So as an American, I'm definitely thankful and proud of that. He also served as Secretary of State under James Madison. So it was kind of seen there for a time, Secretary of State was the stepping stone to the presidency, because you had Thomas Jefferson serve as Secretary of State under George Washington. Madison served as Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson. And then Monroe served as Secretary of State under James Madison. So anyway, you see, is that kind of a stepping stone to the presidency. So we've talked about nationalism and so forth. The country's united. We pretty much have the one party, which is the Democrat-Republican. Sometimes you may see it Republican, but it was kind of the Democrat-Republican party. We finally get respect from Europe. So remember I told you the War of 1812 was the war of respect, and we get it. He's the first president to visit all states, which is impressive, and I think makes him a respectable president by doing that. And but the period is not free of problems. So let's talk about this very important thing. So I definitely want you to highlight this, star this, underline this in your notes. But Henry Clay's American System. It's a big deal. It appears frequently on quizzes and tests. It used to always appear on the AP US History exam every single year. It's proposed by Henry Clay. He was a wealthy planter of Kentucky, was a slave owner, but was seen as a Western. Now, it's weird that seeing that Kentucky was a Western state, but at that time it was seen as a Western state. And so he wants infrastructure improvements. He wants protection of American industry, despite being a farmer from Kentucky. And he wants to keep the Bank of the United States. So it's a three-part system. And we're going to kind of go over that. So the first part is transportation. Now, one thing that makes me proud to be an American is that we have some of the best infrastructure of any country in the world, with our roads, our bridges, our utilities. I mean, you look at our Interstate Highway Act, and I think it was some of the best money the country's ever spent. But before the Civil War, the federal government really did not get involved in transportations, infrastructure, and so forth. Now, I mean, the federal government does all the time. But this day and age, in the 1810s, it was not seen as appropriate, that the federal government should get involved in that. First, the federal government wasn't that well off, and so forth. And so what a lot of the infrastructure improvements are going to happen at the state level and through private enterprise, like turnpikes were built by private entities. States are going to fund the digging of canals to connect rivers, and then with steamships, and then later railroads and so forth. So he is going to be advocating these things. And one of the things too is that he wanted Americans to buy American goods, and he wanted us to become economically self-sufficient, particularly as our rising textile industry is starting to happen in the 1810s, thanks to Samuel Slater bringing over the first steam engine from Britain. And so he does propose a protective tariff of 1816. It gets passed. And so he wanted the United States, its goods, to be competitive, even against British textiles, which were typically cheaper. And so this tariff made British textiles more expensive. And then thirdly, the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. So it gets passed by Hamilton. It gets rechartered in 1816, and then it's going to come up for rechartering again in the 1830s. And we'll talk about that when we get to the Democratic Revolution lecture, because Clay actually pushed for that early. And it's going to come back to bite him in the rear end with Andrew Jackson being president. He thought it was going to lead to Jackson's demise politically, and instead it leads to Jackson getting reelected. So one thing that does get constructed at the federal level is what's called the Cumberland Road, because it starts in Cumberland, Maryland, sometimes referred to as the National Road. I typically refer to it as a National Road because it was a national funded construction project. And it's basically what it is just like kind of crushed gravel, crushed rocks and so forth as a road before you have paved roads. Crushed gravel was kind of like pavement for them back then. And the reason you may think that's a pretty bumpy ride with wagons, yes, but it's certainly a lot better than getting your wagon stuck in a rut and a muddy road when it's heavily rained and so forth. So another thing that gets built at this time is what's called the Erie Canal, and it is not funded by the federal government, but it's the most important canal project, arguably, at least in the continental U.S. and American history. Now, the Panama Canal and U.S. history too, by Teddy Roosevelt, is going to be more important internationally, but this was the most important canal ever constructed in U.S. history within the continental U.S. And so with development of steamboats, you could actually travel upstream. And so it revolutionizes transportation. And then the later railroads are going to revolutionize transportation even more so. And then in the 20th century, you're going to have cars that do that. So, and then later airplanes. So it is incredible what the amount of growth that takes place. And so roads, these crushed gravel canals connecting rivers so that you can use, because ocean, water transportation is always the easiest way to transport heavier goods. And the United States, at least on the eastern half of the United States, is blessed with plentiful amount of rivers. and then navigable rivers too. And then eventually, the railroad boom takes place starting in the 1850s and continues throughout the end of the century. So one of the things is that the United States is encouraging Western land settlement. And so this Land Act of 1820 passed during James Monroe's presidency during the era of good feelings. It basically allowed you to purchase 80 acres of land at a minimum of $1.25. Now you may be thinking, that's so cheap. Well, it was cheap, but still was a lot of money for them back then. And so as these more and more people were pouring into the West, they're wanting to ship their farm goods or other things that they may be making. Not, you don't have as much industry in the West yet, and so it's going to demand transportation. So if you look right here, as Western settlement takes place, so the map on the left is 1830, 1839. That's also the time period when the Removal Act happens. And so you see all these people pouring into the Creek lands, Choctaw, Chickasaw lands, other tribes up in the Midwest that get relocated to Kansas. They are pouring into their lands, the Osage in Arkansas, the Caddo, and others. And so that leads to that. And then you look at the map on the right, and it shows you that people are even moving further west. So instead of just pouring into Ohio and Indiana and Michigan and some of Illinois and Alabama and Mississippi, and a little bit in Arkansas, Louisiana, then you start seeing people pouring more into Wisconsin, more of Illinois, Iowa, southeastern Minnesota, Missouri, more into Arkansas and Louisiana, and so forth, are taking advantage of this Land Act. Now, Texas didn't have the part of the Land Act, but so if you look right here, this just shows you in the green the canals that are constructed that connect rivers. What they're trying to do is connect the rivers of the Midwest to the Great Lakes, and through the Great Lakes, so you can get to other Great Lakes. And so that was tremendously important. And my parents just traveled to Buffalo just a couple of weeks ago to see Niagara Falls, and they also went to Toronto. But Buffalo is the reason why it's such a large city is Lake Erie in the Northeast connects to the Erie Canal via Buffalo, and then it goes all the way to the Hudson River just north of Albany. And then you can take the Hudson River all the way down to New York. So before the Erie Canal was constructed, it takes about 20, 25 years to build. It one-ups New Orleans as the most important port city in the United States. You can also see roads that are constructed on this, particularly turnpikes. It's kind of like a toll road today. You had to pay every so many miles to travel on it. And then you can also see navigable rivers. Some rivers that are smaller are not as navigable, but the ones that are bolded are more navigable and so forth. So it helps you understand. One thing we are blessed with is good transportation opportunities in the U.S. The reasons for westward movement, well, cheap available land. And its population is going to shift to, instead of just majority of our population east of the Appalachians, and you're going to have at least close to 50% are going to be west of the Appalachians. And they're going to take over Native Americans' lands, and so that's going to be a common, unfortunate trend in U.S. history. Land was easy to obtain because they're taken from Native Americans, and then the Native Americans are a little more sparsely populated than they were originally east of the Appalachians in the colonial time period. Also, demand for new farm goods, and now transportation improvements allow people to ship their goods further. They may have not moved as far out west if they couldn't get their farm crops to market. The steamboat was revolutionary, later the railroad, and so that helps. Also, immigrants are starting to pour into our country. There had been the colonial time period. They're increasing at this time, particularly the Irish and the Germans. There's others, a lot of British, northwestern European immigrants, and also Scandinavians that are pouring in, particularly into Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota states. And so really, here's what the Western states want. They want the ability to get a loan easily, so cheap money, easy credit. And so they want to buy it from they want to take out a loan from a state bank rather than Bank United States. So like my wife and I, we have done, we've had 3 home loans now. And the first 2 were from a bank called Bank of the Ozarks, which they were getting it from Fannie Mae. And then the last one was with First Security. And, the availability that we could borrow money to purchase a home was significant. If you are taking out a car loan, that is a line of credit and so forth. So they wanted the ability to get a line of credit to buy land and then potentially buy some farm equipment. They want land to be cheap from the government. Of course, the government's going to end up taking it from the Native Americans so they can get that cheap land. They want improved transportation so they can take their crops or whatever else they're producing and ship it to market to be sold for far cheaper. And one of the things that you'll see with businesses is that transportation is going to always be a big cost. So one of the things you'll see is that Westerners couldn't agree, should we permit slavery or exclude it? So some Western states are going to allow it, some are not. So because of the Northwest ordinances passed the Articles of Confederation government, they banned slavery in the present day Midwest. But Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, those are Western states. They didn't have that prohibition, so they end up allowing it. Now, one thing that does happen that James Monroe is kind of unique in, typically when there's a depression during your presidency, the current president gets blamed for it and doesn't get reelected. James Monroe is the exception to that. And so the Panic of 1819, and this is going to lead a lot of Westerners turning against the national bank, which plays right into Andrew Jackson, who ends up prohibiting the bank's rechartering, and he kind of makes war on the second bank in the United States and really kills it by 1840. If the Panic of 1819 wouldn't have happened, he probably would not have had the popular public support to do the things that he did. So what ends up happening is some of these, what they call wildcat banks, were lending money too easily. They were lending people too much money, lending it to necessarily farmers that too many of them, maybe they couldn't pay it back and so forth. Similar to what happens and the things that lead up to the 2008 recession is that lending had gotten too loose. So when this happens, if banks can't get their money back on their loans and they default, then eventually, if you have enough of that, the state banks are going to close. And what happens is, even if the people who weren't irresponsible with borrowing, if they had their deposits in those state banks, those state banks are not backed up by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which happens in the 1930s and the Great Depression. And what our banks are backed up with today, up to $250,000 an account, you lost all your money if a state bank closed. And so can you imagine your life work, your fortune, or whatever, may not be a big fortune, but there's a lot of money to you, and all of a sudden one day you just lost that money because the state bank closed at no fault of yours. Yeah, you're going to be very distrustful of banks. And that's going to play right into the Jacksonian persona, that he challenged the banks and so forth. And so that's why Jackson was one of the most beloved presidents in American history. So also the value of money fell. So if you had a lot of it, it decreased in value. And then you had unemployment, bankruptcies. And back then, it ends later, but you could be imprisoned for not being able to pay back your debt. Can you imagine how many people would be imprisoned for defaulting on their credit card debt or student loan debt? So the areas of the depression, and usually you'll have any kind of depression in American history, certain parts of the country are affected more than others. So like give you an example, in the 08 recession, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex was not as badly affected as some other parts of the country. But then the 01 dot-com bubble burst, the Dallas Metroplex was affected far more with the closing of Nortel and some other tech companies. But the 08 recession killed Detroit and housing prices in Las Vegas and other places. So in this particular Panic of 1819, it's the West, the Midwest, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Missouri that suffered the most. So it changed a lot of their political outlook, and which is going to lead to the rise of Andrew Jackson. Now, also cities are increasing, particularly with immigration. So if you look at in 1820, you can see the largest cities at this time. Even Salem, outside of Boston, was on this map. You can see New York is by far the biggest. And the reason why it has surpassed Philadelphia is because of the Erie Canal starting to provide that transportation plus immigration. So in the American Revolution, it was Philadelphia that was the largest. Then you look at 1850 and how the map has changed. Now you have more bigger cities in the Midwest. You've got some in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, a little bit in Iowa. You have St. Louis, Louisville is one of the larger cities and so forth. And then also San Francisco and Sacramento out in California. And so, now you got Mobile, Alabama that's making a splash. Also, you look at population density. This map illustrates that the majority of the population by far in 1790 lives east of the Appalachian Mountains. And then you go to population density in 1830, the population has now shifted, not fully, but there's definitely a lot more people living west of the Appalachian Mountains. Some a little bit west of the Mississippi River, mostly still east of the Mississippi River. All right, let's talk about John Marshall and the Supreme Court. So if you remember, John Marshall had been appointed by John Adams in one of his midnight appointments, kind of in his last week in office. And he controlled the court until about 1822 and had great influence over it until about 1835. You're looking at about 35 years this guy influenced the Supreme Court. Marshall helped shape the evolution of the Constitution and has had much influence over it as any judge in U.S. history. Three principles inform Marshall's jurisprudence. He was committed to judicial authority. He thought the Supreme Court should have great authority in judging something passed by Congress as constitutional. He believed in the supremacy of national law. So anytime it's a battle between state and federal government, he's always going to take the side of typically the federal government, and also traditional property rights. Marshall favored a loose interpretation of the Constitution. He is a Federalist and carried out the ideals of Alexander Hamilton. And after Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court did not void another congressional law until the Dred Scott decision in 1857. And I'll cover that in this part 2 of the Road to Civil War lecture. The Marshall Court did, however, overturn state laws that infringed on the Constitution. And when the Second Bank of the United States set up branches in the states, Maryland decided to tax the branch in its state. All right, so let's talk about Supreme Court cases. So remember this, if you remember nothing else about John Marshall, stronger federal government. Okay, every Supreme Court is going to favor a stronger federal government. He's going to rule against the states. Okay, so let's look at McCulloch versus Maryland. This one is what I like to call the Bank Supreme Court case. And what happened is the state of Maryland was trying to tax the branch of the national bank. So the bank branch argued that the Maryland law infringed on the powers of the national government and therefore it was unconstitutional. Maryland argued that Congress lacked the constitutional authority to charter a national bank, and even if it was legitimate, they had the right to tax it. Marshall's court rejected both arguments. Marshall's court stated the bank was constitutional. So the national bank was constitutional, and he favored a loose interpretation that the state of Maryland did not have the power to tax the branch, as it would create a state of dependency on the federal government on the states. So he ruled in favor of the national bank branch. Now, and what you have with Gibbons versus Ogden is another Supreme Court case, which I don't have listed up here on this slide, but it happens in 1824. The court's decision struck down a monopoly that the New York legislature had granted to Aaron Ogden for steamboat passenger service across the Hudson River to New Jersey. So basically, the state of New York legislature had kind of helped out this one guy named Aaron Ogden to kind of give his steamboat company monopoly. And because his Supreme Court company crossed state lines from New York to New Jersey, the Supreme Court argued that no, the Constitution gave the federal government the authority to regulate interstate commerce, and that will be a common trend throughout U.S. history. The Chief Justice sided with Thomas Gibbons, who held a federal license to transport people and goods between the two states. So he's basically saying that it ruled against to have a monopoly. And that would not be the last time the Supreme Court would rule against somebody having a monopoly. Okay. Now, in Cohen's versus Virginia, this one's kind of an interesting case. You had the selling of lottery tickets that was taking place in 1821. And basically, they were illegally doing it. But this court case, well, it was a court case passed at the Virginia Supreme Court level and not the national Supreme Court level. And basically all it was is the Supreme Court ruled that they had the right to review any decision made at the lower courts, like the state Supreme Court. So anyway, now, so this is Gibbons versus Ogden, went over that. So all three of these important cases limited states' rights. So thing to remember. All right, let's talk about property rights cases. So Marshall was also determined to protect property rights from the states. He invoked the contract clause of the Constitution, which is in Article 1 and Section 10 of the Constitution, that prohibits the states from passing any law impairing the obligation of contracts. So in Fletcher versus Peck, which is 1810 when James Madison was president, the case involved a large grant of land made by the Georgia legislature to the Yazoo Land Company. When a new legislature canceled the grant, alleging fraud and bribery, which it probably was, Speculators who had already purchased Yazoo lands appealed to the Supreme Court to uphold their titles. Marshall Court upheld the contract of the Yazoo Land Company, and this safeguarded vested property rights. So even if the land had been given because of a bribe and so forth, and the later land speculators hadn't done anything, then they ruled in favor of the later land speculators. All right, now the Dartmouth College versus Woodward was kind of interesting because Daniel Webster had graduated from Dartmouth. It's an Ivy League school. Dartmouth College had been given a land grant from like King George way back in 1769, before the American Revolution. Well, the state of New Hampshire wanted to change it and move the college to a different location. And they wanted to turn it, instead of a private university, into a public university. Daniel Webster and alumni pleaded the case, and the court upheld the rights of the college, and Marshall and the court went against states' rights in these cases. So states are 0 for 5 so far. Here's John Marshall on the left, and here's Daniel Webster. All right, let's talk about the rise of John Quincy Adams. He is the son of John Adams, who had been a Federalist, but nevertheless, he had changed his political views to become a Democrat-Republican right before the War of 1812. And he came to national attention for his role in negotiating the Treaty of Ghent, which thankfully we didn't lose any territory, and ended the War of 1812. Adams was probably one of the most brilliant Secretary of States in American history, arguably one of the smartest people that's ever served in the White House. Unfortunately, he was his father's son and lacked some people skills and tended to tick people off, and that's going to be his demise. So he ignored traditional Republican antagonism towards Great Britain. In 1817, Adams negotiated the Rush-Bagot Treaty. Okay. And that was the one that dealt with the Aroostook War. I'm sorry, that's the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. The Rush-Bagot Treaty had limited naval armaments on the Great Lakes. And if you remember, after the War of 1812, both sides began arming their navy tremendously in the Great Lakes. It was one of the most defended borders in the world. And ironically, today, it's the U.S. and Canada border is the least defended border anywhere in the world. And then also, he set the 49th parallel as a border between Canada and the lands of the Louisiana Purchase. So you look right here, is Louisiana Purchase 1803. It doesn't include part of North Dakota and Minnesota. And then what he does is the Rush-Bagot Agreement agreed to that 49th parallel right there at the Northern Louisiana Territory. So we lose this territory. If you can see this dotted line go right up above the 49th parallel, we lose that to Canada, but then we get everything south of it. And then we also agreed to joint use the Oregon Territory for about 10 years. We'll see that later James K. Polk is going to sell that dispute Oregon, and we split it about 50-50 with Canada. So anyway, one of the things that happens next is the Adams-Onis Treaty. And so it's dealing with Florida. Now, Florida was still controlled by Spain, okay? And what had happened is some of the Seminoles had been going into Georgia and raiding and killing American settlers. Now, General Jackson was ordered to go down there and round up some of the Cherokees that had been doing this and bring them to justice. Well, not only did Jackson do this, he kind of went above what he was ordered to do. And not only to capture Seminole chiefs and hang them, he also captured the Spanish governor of Florida and ran him out of town. Now, a lot of people were calling for Jackson to be tried and so forth for those actions, but John Quincy Adams, on the other hand, was like, well, let's use this to our advantage. Spain was kind of weak at this time, and they had lost a bunch of territory in the Latin American revolutions. And the next year in 1820, they're going to lose Mexico. They were willing to sell, and so he uses kind of what Jackson had done to encourage Spain to sell us Florida. Now, we bought Florida for a whopping $5 million. And you think about the retirement capital of the USA for $5 million, that's a smoking deal in American history if I ever saw one. And so that is going to be a significant thing. And then one of the things that, too, is Adams persuaded President Monroe to assert American national policy in the Western Hemisphere. So let me kind of explain what happens with the Monroe Doctrine. This is very important. This is a painting of Andrew Jackson as he helped bring Florida into the United States. And John Quincy Adams is who negotiated that. But Jackson kind of had gone past what he was ordered to do, and that's why he kind of got in trouble. But anyway, it all worked out. We bought Florida for a whopping $5 million, baby. And we also gave up any territorial claims to Texas. You're right. We'll annex that bad boy in 1845. So let's look at the Monroe Doctrine. Now, one of the things that happened is as Spain was getting the snot beat out of it by the Latin American revolutions throughout the Western Hemisphere in Mexico and on south, France and Spain and some other countries were thinking about ganging up and trying to reclaim their colonies that they had lost to the Creoles, these European-born elite in the Western Hemisphere and Latin American nations. And so Britain was worried that we're going to try to recolonize that area and that might lead to future conflict militarily. So Britain said that, hey, they'll back us, the United States, if we tell them to stay out of Western Hemisphere affairs. So John Quincy Adams actually wrote it. James Monroe delivered it to Congress. And basically what it was sent to these European countries that, hey, you guys stay out of the Western Hemisphere, okay, and we'll stay out of your affairs. Now, we do that until World War I. But we're going to use the Monroe Doctrine. We don't use it in the 1810s and 1820s when it came about. We use it later in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Particularly, Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to truly use the Monroe Doctrine more so than any other president before him. There is going to be somebody using it in the Gilded Age as well. And so, really, though, the main reason why we passed it is it's kind of random, but Russia had been creating a colony in Alaska and for logging. And I've also seen some of their effects of their logging because I've been on Sitka Island in Alaska, and the trees there take like 200 or 300 years to grow, the type of fir tree that's there. And the Russians that have cut down every tree on the island didn't realize how long they take to regrow. And so they quit logging on Sitka Island because of that. Now the trees have grown back some, but they're like teenagers in tree life. But they began moving fishing settlements along the Oregon Territory and almost Northern California. And so because we had eyed that territory, we didn't want Russia to be setting up colonies over there. So we kind of aimed the Monroe Doctrine in the short term, not just at France and Spain, but at Russia as well. So definitely want to highlight, underline the Monroe Doctrine. Usually appears on a quiz, typically appears on your test as well. Okay. That's the Monroe Doctrine. Don't use it till later. Okay. And you can see right here from this map all the dates that are listed as all these different countries become independent from Spain or Brazil comes from Portugal. All right, now last thing we're going to talk about in this lecture is the Missouri Compromise. Extremely, extremely important. Highlight it, star it, underline it several times, whatever you need to do, but you've got to know the Missouri Compromise. It is tremendously important between 1820 all the way until it gets overturned in 1857 with the Dred Scott Supreme Court case. So tremendously important. It keeps peace between northern states and southern states up until 1860 when the South secedes from the Union. So let's look at the growth of sectionalism that leads to the Missouri Compromise. Now, at this time in the 1810s and 1820s, you have three distinct regions of the country. As time goes along, by the time of the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, you're going to have two distinct regions, the North and the South. Okay, but at this time, from the 1810s all the way till the end of the Mexican-American War, you really have three parts of the country. You have the Northeast, okay, focused on industry, thanks to the invention of the steam engine. It had good transportation, innovations and so forth, like canals and steamboats and so forth. The South primarily was agricultural based. And then the West was kind of farming and then also developed for transportation. So now you can look at who's kind of the economic leader. Daniel Webster, kind of the spokesman for the Northeast. He was a Whig candidate. John Calhoun is for the South, and then Henry Clay for the West. Okay, you can read this right here, kind of what they're wanting and why they were opposed to it. The South's opposed to the American system. They didn't feel like a lot of the transportation innovations benefited them, so they didn't want their tax money going to that. The Northeast wanted it. They wanted to end cheap public land. The reason why, because they were losing population. And then the West, they want cheap land and they want the transportation because it benefited them. Okay. So here's a picture of Daniel Webster, bottom left. Okay. They're against slavery, and a lot of them believe the government should abolish it because there wasn't slavery in the Northeast. And then in the South, big time on cotton growing and some other crops. There's John Calhoun, creepy looking man in American history, but he was opposed to tariffs in the American system because it felt like it didn't benefit him, benefited other parts of the country. And then Henry Clay is kind of the spokesperson for the West, and they wanted cheap land, and basically some supported slavery, some didn't in the West, depending on where you were. All right, so in 1819, Missouri was first part of the Louisiana Purchase to apply for statehood. Later, it's going to be Louisiana. But so, should Missouri become a slave state or a free state? So currently, you had 11 free states and 11 slave states. And so, had this gone passed in the Senate, this would have probably forever changed the course of history. The Tallmadge Amendment basically said that there are already slaves there, but it's going to prohibit future slaves coming there from slave owners. And once a slave reached the age of 25, they would be set free. So it would have gradually emancipated slaves in Missouri and would have prevented future slavery in the Louisiana Purchase. So if that would have been the case, you would have only had like Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and maybe Florida that would have been slave states. And so but unfortunately, the House passed it because there are more states that don't have more population in those states that don't have slaves than the states that do. But the Senate, it's an equal balance, so all the Southern senators voted no. So the South wanted to maintain the free and slave state balance to make sure that they didn't lose and get that voted out. And so what ends up happening is to keep peace, a guy named Henry Clay from the West proposes this compromise. And so what he did is Missouri would be admitted as a slaveholding state. And then Maine, which originally was part of Massachusetts, had now had enough population to become a state, mainly because of logging and then fishing on the coast. Maine would be admitted as a free state. So it would have 12 slave states, 12 free states. And then any territory acquired in the Louisiana Purchase north of a 3630 line. So that means the 3630 line is the border between Arkansas and Missouri. Anything north of that line would be free. So it'd be like Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and Montana would be free. And then the states below it, like Arkansas, Louisiana, of course, later Texas, even though it was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, would be slave. Okay, so in theory, there'd eventually be more free states. So it does get passed, and it lasts for 30 plus years. Okay, so you can see from this map, the 3630 line is that Missouri-Arkansas border. So that's why Arkansas becomes a slave state. So anyway, it was a fair compromise. Both sides got something that they wanted. Unfortunately, it kicks the can down the road on the issue of slavery, and that's going to erupt big time with the turning point in U.S. history of the American Civil War, and thousands of American lives are going to be lost to put an end to slavery, and those that are fighting to preserve it. So Missouri Compromise, have to know it. And that's it.